Grüß willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 32 of my Star Trek TOS timeline series of videos. This will be my last in this series of videos. In this video I'll be discussing the possibility of gaming or creating board and figure games for the Star Trek universe of TOS. As I've indicated, this is almost certainly the last of my Star Trek TOS timeline videos. When I get a better studio and sound system, I will most likely redo these videos, which is my normal practice on my other channel. Most of these videos existed in an older format on this site and my previous YouTube and BitChute sites, but they did not include Season 3 data, which is why when I did Season 3, all the various chapters came pouring out. They've been under development for at least the last 6 years. As these videos are not about any current events, like many other YouTube folks sort of focus on, these are more a historical analysis of a TV series. They tend to remain relevant as a result over time, although updating and improving the videos does add significant value. As a result, I will almost certainly do that over time. I wish to thank those who provided good feedback, specifically the audio quality issue. I did not realise the audio on a mobile phone was quite so bad. It's mainly related to echo. As a short-term solution, I'm using some audio mats, but what I really need is a new studio and improved audio equipment. Most of my YouTube videos are posted on my main channel and are primarily related to military history and figure gaming. I find most of those viewers do not watch my videos on a mobile phone, thus the audio issue is not as noticeable. But it seems with my sci-fi and anime channel, mobile usage is much higher, thus it's more of an issue. This series of videos completes a project I actually began in the late 1990s, which was to create the scripts of each TV show from the actual DVD shows that I possessed. This, in the end, provided too difficult back then, so I put the project on the back burner. But then I discovered the Chikate site with all the scripts already corrected or created. Once this occurred, the project began anew. While I only created this channel back in 2020, I originally posted my videos on my main channel, which was created 10 years prior to this, and that was the true beginning of this project. That is the YouTube project. Most of the older videos have been removed as they've been updated, and it took me several years to plough through each season, coupled with large gaps in between. It's taken me over 10 years to finally complete my analysis of all the seasons and create my timeline videos. I have no doubt that I've made errors and that there will be some fine-tuning in the future, but this is about as complete as it'll ever possibly get. I hope it's complete enough to be useful. I suppose this makes me a rather serious fan, or as the Japanese would say, otaku. However, I did it to clear up confusion concerning canon. When I watched the original Star Trek, shortly after it was first broadcast in my country, my ability to understand English was limited, but I was captivated with the series. When my English improved to the point I could understand what was going on, my interest only grew, and I loved the world-building aspect of this series. This was rather unique and interesting. I formulated a vision of what I believed the Star Trek universe looked like, and that was maintained through the movies. However, when I watched TNG, it was clear canon had changed a great deal. I absolutely loved TNG, so I have no issues with the series. But its worldview differed so much from my memories of TOS, I decided to analyse TOS to see if my memories were accurate or not. As it turned out, I did discover my memories had many gaps and incorrect assumptions, but it was also clear TNG bore only a superficial resemblance to TOS, especially by the end of the series. Voyager and DS9 did not stretch canon as much, but Enterprise was a real canon breaker. All the series are great and I love them all, but they were not set in the same timeline as TOS. I continued to analyse it to see what had changed, why this change had occurred. And then when people started talking about the Kelvin timeline, then I came to the conclusion that TOS must clearly have its own timeline. the more I researched, the more obvious this fact was. However, apart from the analysis, what made me realise, but apart from this, the analysis that I conducted made me realise a whole lot of other things that I'd never considered before. There is a lot more in TOS than you may think on the surface. The Earth colonisation program was one interesting aspect that I kind of became enlightened upon. The other was the reality of warfare in the universe of Star Trek, and finally the realisation of the critical importance of food to the colonisation effort and the way the militaries operated. These realisations came thick and fast, and it was more than I'd ever considered or thought about in the past. So I'm glad I did do this analysis. Completing this analysis project now and realising all these interesting logistic factors, colonisation, food, the way the military works, etc., has making me think about games, mainly board gaming and figure gaming for the Star Trek TOS universe. I may consider creating some rules in the future, but that's not really my objective here, and I would actually prefer to use existing rules and just do whatever tweaking I think was required. What I want to cover here now is what type of Star Trek games could be viable and interesting, of course. I'm leaving computer games out of this equation. I mainly want to focus on board gaming, cardboard, etc., and figure gaming with plastic or metal figures, and any required crossovers which may make sense between these two type of gaming mediums. Strangely enough, I'd never really looked at Star Trek figures in the past, but once I started looking on the web, I discovered that there was a surprisingly good range of them. This shows some Federation plastic figures, or Federation spacecraft plastic figures on bases, which look quite good. They look like they're actually pre-painted and pre-decaled as well. This shows some Klingon spacecraft, almost certainly also plastic on bases, which have been pre-painted and pre-decaled. The issue I see is because of licensing, there must be a lack of suppliers of the exact figures, because some of these figures don't resemble the spacecraft in the series, for example, but nonetheless there seems to be a reasonable range. When I went looking for suppliers of these figures, this is one that I discovered. This section is a list of all the figure manufacturers I could find quickly. I'm sure there are more. Once again, my main focus is TOSS, which strangely enough, or actually probably not strangely enough, seem to be easier to find than TNG figures. The Starfleet store also has a reasonable range of spacecraft. This shows a range of Romulan spacecraft, which does a good job catering to TOS space battles. This pretty much covers most of the Romulan spacecraft that you would potentially use in a game. Now, some of the more theoretical spacecraft, which non-canon people have created, are not here. This really only does cover the canon spacecraft and older non-canon spacecraft, but nonetheless, it's a good range. I found another site, in this case starfleetgames.com. This contains figures as well as rules and board games in addition. So I found there was a good range of figures, if a bit disjointed and different scales, so a bit of work would need to be done in that particular area, but nonetheless you can actually find the figures. Now let's take a look at the games. Now the first type of game you could consider is refighting the actual space battles. I found a plethora of rules which cover these types of battles, which are mainly focused on the slugging it out type of gaming. Let's look at some of these rules. The first set of rules I found, and I'll go by order of when they were first published, is the Starfleet battles. This first came out in 1979. It was apparently a re-implementation and expanded version of an original pocket game, whatever that was. This is the classic game of tactical starship combat set in the Star Trek universe, the original TV show, although you'll never see Star Trek anywhere in the game, licensing limitations obviously. Players command one or more ships from the Federation, Klingon, Gorn, Romulan or Kinitsi fleet, supporting all the Star Trek weaponry like phasers, disruptor bolts, photons and plasma torpedoes and tractor beams. Also included other weaponry not commonly seen, such as drones, homing missiles. Basically, the way this game is players allocate energy and plot movement before each turn, then move all the ships simultaneously. Weapons are fired at will during the turn. Ships have shields and armour for protection. When these are breached, various ship systems are damaged, potentially crippling the combat capacity of the ship and eventually resulting in ship destruction. This seems to be a set of rules that generally covers small fleet actions. Full Thrust, which came out in 1994, at least this version did, is another set of rather old rules which have gone through many revisions and updates. They are simple, focus on ships slugging it out with each other, and available as a free set of rules, with the link shown here. I've seen a number of games of Full Thrust in my various wargaming journeys. This set of figures are designed to reproduce DS9 battles. This is outside the scope of my video series, as I'm only looking at TOS, but I must admit they do look rather nice. These rules allow you to apparently recreate much larger battles and seem to probably be the most popular among hardcore gamers. A latter set of rules, which came out in 2009, was Starmada. I'm uncertain when the first version was published, but Fleet Ops was apparently published in 2009, which is what you see here, and allows for fleet operations, which is probably what I would mainly be interested in. Now, in this particular case, I'll just read the description. Starmada Fleet Ops takes the universal game of starship combat to a whole new level. Now you can fight larger battles than ever before, with fast play mechanics and streamlined rules that retain all the flexibility and customization you've come to expect. And the thing goes on concerning some more of the details. Now, this also looks like a very interesting set of rules. Generically outlandish big space fleets, or GOBs, is designed to fill the high-level category. It's not very granular in terms of how each ship is controlled. It's basically moving to a range and shoot. But the ships have different classes and capabilities selected by the player, and there's some limited damage tracking. Basically, it's a whittled down to what an admiral would know about his forces and would command. This seems like a much higher level game, and it does actually seem interesting if you wish to recreate very large battles, although I'm not sure how many really large battles did occur in the particularly TOS universe. Maybe the Earth-Romulan wars, where the spacecraft were much smaller, you'd have a lot more of them, perhaps, but certainly the later wars seem to be focused around fleets of maybe 6 to 12 capital ships and supporting ships. But anyway, nonetheless, an interesting set of simple rules. As you can see, there are many rules which can cater for refighting of space battles. Upon looking at the rules, my only thought is a set of rules which focuses more on movement coupled with simple combat systems, which may offer some additional benefit. Although some of the rules kind of go in that direction. I'm mainly thinking of something a little bit more in that direction. Back in the day, I used to play a game called Battlefield Mars, which had nothing to do with Star Trek. It was more to do with space combat in the solar system, and it was an SPI game, very detailed and quite good. And it actually had many features which I thought was quite interesting. So if you took that into Star Trek, you may get an interesting game. Basically, the fleets operate on a 3D playing area divided into squares, with each square, basically occupied by a ship. So you'd have your ship on, what you see here is on the left, the XY, on the right, XZ, and you would have a ship on each, and that would tell you its full three-dimensional location. Each ship has, as a result, an X, Y, and Z location, but also, more importantly, each ship has an X, Y, Z momentum, which players allocated energy to change momentum, deploy shields and 5 phases, and for photon torpedoes not requiring energy, but having possibly a lower accuracy, but with a greater range and limited in terms of numbers per ship. Players move ships in one of several different movement phases based on overall momentum. So, when you have an XYZ momentum, you total that together to give you an overall momentum to tell you what the overall speed is. So obviously you'll be moving more per sub-phase than if you were moving slower. And during each sub-phase, you would have the ability to fire your weapons. That way, what you would do is you would sit up before the game, determine momentums, determine your plans, and then it would all be disclosed, and then the ships would all basically move automatically. And when you saw an opportunity to fire your weapons in an effective manner, you would do so. And if you stuffed up, you would basically die. And if you did something really clever, you would win. So it's more of a puzzle type game, which involves, luck, but luck from the point of view of you deciding, not luck based on spinning a dice. Maybe something like that would be interesting. I certainly enjoyed Battlefleet Mars in the day, back in the 70s anyway. Let's move to the next type of game. That would be more of a strategic game, allowing players to refight one of the possibly three major conflicts between the various forces in TOS. United Earth versus Romulans, Klingons versus Romulans, and Klingons versus Federation, with an optional game allowing you to refight the later Federation-Klingon War, which the Organians stopped. Another game I used to play back in the day was the old SPI Star Force game. Once again, nothing to do with Star Trek, but the basic principles could be used to reproduce one of those four major battles, which involved, advancing, contracting, logistics, etc. So this game would be a game which highlights logistics issues, as well as understanding the objectives that both sides need to achieve in each conflict. The actual battle, which consists of stacks of ship counters, which represent your fleet, meeting and with some simple combat systems which allow you to determine a victor and a loss. Now, in this case, this is again three-dimensional. What you have here is, the central point, which is whatever point you decide to select. It goes 23 hexes in all directions, including up and down. So your fleet would also have a height value as well, which sort of adds to the interest of it. So if this, for example, represented full Federation space for 200 light years in all directions, you would have the Romulans slowly advancing from the right towards the Sol system, and then probably getting stopped somewhere along that line and forced back. You'd probably move the whole thing slightly to the left so you could include Romulan space, which will allow the Federation to retake Romulan space. It's quite interesting. You would also have diplomacy built into this game because, the United Earth in particular, would be probably diplomatically engaged with Vulcan and all the other allied planets to try and get whatever possible assistance that they possibly could, and the Romulans would be probably trying to keep those out of the Federation or United Earth side. So it would be an interesting game. The final type of game is a generic grand strategy game, probably displaying the entire area around all the various players and having a random deployment and race attribute system. All players then grow their empire using their unique advantages or suffering, or their disadvantages are required or forced. I feel this would make for a very good multiplayer game. Now, in this case, this comes from another SPI board game I used to play quite a bit, Outreach, and as you can see here, this actually includes something like 50% of the entire galaxy, so you wouldn't be creating a map this large, it would be significantly smaller. But basically, along these lines, each hex represents multiple planets, and your United Earth Federation would expand, Klingon would expand, etc., meet each other, fight battles. It would be an interesting multiplayer game, but it would have to be comparatively simple. Let's now look at what kind of Star Trek games actually exist to satisfy these two board gaming requirements. The old Federation and Empire board game, which came out in 1986, probably would allow you to satisfy both these requirements in a fairly simple manner. This is a sprawling empire game set in the Star Trek universe. Players command one or more races in a variety of scenarios as they replay the historical situations in the galactic politics of the future. Anyway, that's my brief overview of the possible gaming, but this basically is the end of my current video series on the Star Trek series. I wish to emphasise this only covers facts which agree with the TOS script. In some cases, I've taken facts from some later scripts which cause no issue with TOS and have used them, but I've not included every possible fact from other series. I didn't want to introduce too many outside influences into the series of videos to avoid confusion. The next point is the TOS timeline is not obviously our timeline, and neither is it TNG, Voyager, DS9 or Enterprise timeline. The differences are simply too great, and I have to assume this is a separate timeline. One of my viewers commented the timeline split may have occurred when the Star Trek TV series was aired in the US. In the TOS timeline, Gene was rejected after the cage. I like this explanation, but I suspect it may be too meta, or at least that's what the person who suggested it may be. A better explanation is it's caused by the Enterprise's trips back to Earth. You know, they went back in 1968 and once again in 69. The trip in 1969 was immediately after the Enterprise encountered the alternative universe pair, you know, the multicoloured folks. Perhaps the Enterprise retrieved some device from the alien machine which resulted in them being allowed to go back into time when they met the Black Sun. If someone was going to write an episode on the matter, there are a lot of different reasons they could use for the explanation of how the time slip occurred, and I would certainly welcome some fan films along those lines. I've talked about TOS, but you know what? Someone could do something similar to the series of videos and of the TNG scripts. Why not analyse the TNG scripts and identify the exact TNG timeline? I suspect if they did that, they would end up with something closer to the modern understanding of the Star Trek timeline. I'll leave that to others to consider, but I suspect that is a timeline which most people would be familiar with, not the timeline I'm showing you here, which is the TOS timeline. And it probably would align better with, you know, other sites on the internet such as Memory Alpha. After I complete this video, I'll almost certainly move back to my historical channel for a while, but in terms of this channel, my intention is to redo the videos in the future, improving the sound quality, correcting errors, and fleshing out any of my conclusions. Examples are my thought on warp and impulse has changed a large amount since I posted these videos over the last month. So adding that new information into a version 2 of the video which covers warp and impulse power, I think would be quite useful, and probably that may be one of my first redone videos, although I'm certainly not going to redo anything for quite a while. Other examples would be my Federation Starship video, which I'm sure that I've missed some ships. If I do find those ships, I'll go back and correct them. However, I certainly don't intend to do that for at least a year. I think I'm Star Trek out at the present moment. In terms of expanding the video series beyond, rather than just going back and correcting and editing, if I do continue the video series, I would probably add the animated series episode to my timeline. But as this would require an enormous amount of work, I suspect this will not occur for well over a year, if not several years from now. And so we come to an end of my part 32 of my Star Trek TOS timeline, in this case discussing gaming and ending the series of videos. What you can see here is the links to the various games that I've talked about in this particular video. If anyone's interested in Star Trek gaming, these links may assist you. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.